This is a remastered replay of one of our most popular episodes. Enjoy.
An end goal might be giving people a driving experience that they find exhilarating or something like that. To me, the first version of that probably isn't a scooter. It's probably you take my 10-year-old Toyota Yaris and you put some really big speakers in there. And whenever I hit the accelerator, you make a giant zooming noise and see how customers react to that.
You're listening to the Startup Podcast. This is an educational episode, in-depth masterclasses about the concepts essential to building, running, and investing in Silicon Valley-style startups. Whether you're a founder, investor, or operator in a startup, you'll gain insights into the principles that power high-growth disruption, the same way Facebook, Google, and Uber do it. The conversation starts now.
I'm Yaniv, a software engineer, operator, coach, advisor, investor, and people geek. I've worked at Google in a number of scale-ups and am now co-founder at Circular, a high-growth startup.
And I'm Chris. I'm a serial entrepreneur. I've been building products, brands, marketplaces, startups, and go-to-market strategies for over 20 years, including 10 years building venture-backed businesses in Silicon Valley. And now I'm semi-retired, helping a small handful of startups fast forward to the best high-growth outcomes through one-on-one advisory engagements.
And our job on this show is to guide you through the unique mindset and approach that drives Silicon Valley-style disruption at scale.
Today, we're going to discuss how to execute successfully, particularly in early stage startups. Specifically, what do we mean by execution? What does good execution look like at the early stages? What the fuck is an MVP? How do you know if you have product market fit? What is a pivot and when to pivot? Common mistakes in early stage startups and examples of great execution at this stage.
Okay, so let's kick off the conversation. We talked about ideas last time. Now we want to talk about execution. But what do we mean by execution?
Maybe in the most simplistic way, it's turning your ideas into reality. It's moving from a land of potentiality into a land of actuality. It's knuckling down and getting shit done. It's about making stuff happen.
Yeah, that's right. And my last two jobs have been as chief operating officer, and often, especially at more traditional companies, this execution is sometimes referred to as operations. And I've never liked that term for the broader execution because it makes it sound like it's just the day-to-day, right? The idea is up on its throne and then you just kind of need to operate the idea. Whereas in fact, execution is really where the magic happens. It's where all the value is. And so when I think of myself as a chief operating officer, I think of myself as being in charge of execution. Now, of course, chief execution officer would be a real problem for a number of reasons as a title. But when I say, and I think you agree with me that execution is where the magic happens. Why is it so hard? Why isn't it for that traditional view?
You run into so many inexperienced first-time founders, and they will often be enthusiastic to share with you their big, grand idea, but they're often frozen in place at that stage. Perhaps it's because it's very easy to have that initial idea, and we talked in the last episode about why ideas are worthless. I think today's topic is the clearest example of why ideas in and of themselves are worthless, because the really, really hard, grindy value creation part is in the how and the what and the when of the execution. I think perhaps most founders get stuck at the idea part because they just don't know what to do next. The what to do next part is really what we want to discuss today. And there's obviously a lot of different pathways you can take, but there are a few general patterns that are absolutely essential.
Just to add to that, I think one of the reasons why the execution is so important is you hinted at it in the last episode when you talked about how you're actually generating more and more ideas as you build your product. And it's never one idea. It's actually thousands of ideas and there's learning. And so it's nearly the idea of separating the ideation from the execution is the wrong model. Execution is where most of the ideas are validated and created. And so being able to integrate those things and being able to execute in a way that turns your idea into a reality is really important. And again, if you think of mental models, right? The older traditional model is you have an idea and then you implement it. Whereas the startup view is you have an idea and you validate it and you refine it and you flesh it out and you change it. And that is inextricably linked to the execution stage.
I love that. And the key piece of jargon there is you hypothesize, you run experiments, and you iterate. This brings to mind a quote from Muhammad Ali, I think, where he said, "Everyone has a plan until you get punched in the face."
You'd like to think it's Muhammad Ali. It is actually Mike Tyson. That's the one beautiful piece of poetry that he ever spoke in his life.
All right. Well, Mike Tyson. And what he's really saying in relation to startups is you can have this big idea. You can write your 10 or 15-page investor deck. Some people have gone off and awkwardly written a 40-page business plan, which is a complete fail. But the moment you actually try to build something and put it into people's hands, you will learn more than you've learned in weeks and months and years of research and thinking and planning and discussing. And so that's why you want to avoid going away and doing too much thinking. You should absolutely fall in love with a problem, some pain or friction or suffering or inefficiency in the world. You might have even developed, we're all human. We've maybe fallen in love with some big grand vision of the solution we want to build because we just can't help it. We can see it vividly in our minds and we've drawn it in stark relief. We know the thing we want to create. And that's fine. You've done that. Everyone does that. What you want to do next is you want to promptly forget it. Forget that grand ideal. And you want to work backwards to a very, very pragmatic and very specific persona and problem. Extremely narrow, what I call embarrassingly narrow. So let me give you an example of what this looks like. If you were to think about Uber today, you would think of Uber as a company that maybe transforms the world through real-time on-demand logistics. Incredibly ambitious, incredibly bold, incredibly disruptive. But Uber's first product, its first go-to-market motion, was to target specifically affluent San Franciscans with black cars. The idea was that if you had a lot of money in San Francisco and didn't want to wait for a taxi, you could press a button and get a limo. And that's where they started. So a very specific city, a very specific target market, a very specific kind of transportation. And of course, now Uber does, groceries and food and peer-to-peer ride sharing, but they start with that one specific, pragmatic, focused thing before scaling to the rest.
Yeah, it's interesting. That term embarrassment and the virtues of doing embarrassing things actually comes up quite often in that early stage of a startup. And I'd like to dig into why that is and why it's important, right?
Yeah.
But we need to take a couple of steps back first.
Whether you're starting or scaling your company's security program, demonstrating top-notch security practices and establishing trust is more important than ever. Vanta automates compliance with SOC 2, ISO 27001, and more, saving you time and money while helping you build customer trust. Plus, you can streamline security reviews by automating questionnaires and demonstrating your security posture with a customer-facing trust center, all powered by Vanta AI. And it gets even better. Just for TSP listeners, you can get $1,000 off Vanta when you go to vanta.com/TSP. That's VANTA.com/TSP for the Startup Podcast to get $1,000 off.
We're talking today especially about good execution in an early stage startup. And in particular, to introduce another bit of jargon, I consider an early stage startup one that has not yet hit its product market fit. So Chris, I know you talk about product market fit quite a lot. Would you like to give a bit of a definition? And, this is more of an art than a science, but what is product market fit and why is it such a pivotal transition point for a startup?
So product market fit is when you've built something so compelling, delightful, effective at solving a real problem for a user that the users start to pull it out of your hands versus you trying to push it onto them. They eagerly learn about it, pick it up, use it, fall in love with it, tell their friends about it, and then their friends learn about it, pick it up, use it, and fall in love with it.
Right. And so it's, I talked a little bit last time about jobs to be done and the idea of hiring a product or a solution for a particular job in your life, in your work life or your personal life. And so product market fit is when people see your solution, your product and say, God damn, this is the one I want to hire. And the reason it's so pivotal to startups is usually your first, second, third, 10th attempt at what you're building is not going to have product market fit. Speaking back to our ideas episode, you might have an idea for a solution and you think this is going to be awesome. But then when it meets the reality of the real world, you'll find that for one reason or another, it's not quite right. People will not hire it for that job, or if they do hire it, they'll quickly fire it. In other words, they'll churn. So getting to product market fit is really important. And in effect, getting there is the sole or primary job of an early stage startup. So then the question becomes, and we've been hinting at some of the answers. Okay, so what does it look like to efficiently get to product market fit as a startup? That is the key of good execution at the early stage. Efficiently using your resources, especially your capital, which is quite precious at this time, to get to product market fit.
Let's talk about what it does not involve, because I
Mm.
see a lot of people doing a lot of things that they don't need to do. What it does not involve is running around talking to partners who you might need down the track when you have a product. It does not involve talking to academia for weeks and months on end to do some kind of study. It does not involve going to every conference and meetup and socializing and schmoozing and ideating endlessly. It does not involve sitting at home writing long planning documents and doing endless market research. It does not involve any of those things. It may involve a few of those things, depending on what you're doing. It might involve doing those things a little bit to validate some of your early inklings, to talk to some early customers, to maybe see if there's some academia to support your new principles of healthcare or something. But it does not involve doing that for any protracted period of time.
So what it does involve is getting punched in the face over and over until you figure out how to not get punched in the face so bad. And, there's actually this really interesting study. It gets mentioned in a number of books about photography students. And it was a controlled study. Basically, there was a particular semester where they divided the students up into two groups. And one student was told that they would be graded on the quality of their best photo. Basically, they had to submit one photo at the end of the semester and they would be graded on how good that was. The other half of the experiment would be graded on the number of photos they took. So they just had to take as many as possible, and it was just a volume game. Now, you might think that the people who were focused on quality would end up having the highest quality photo. But what actually happened is when the photos from the group that were told to focus on quantity were actually assessed by the judges or by the professor, they ended up being higher quality than the people who were told to just submit their best single photograph. And the reason for that is because the people who focused on quantity were incentivized to just try a lot of things. They were just out there every day with their cameras, taking photos, refining the techniques, trying different things, building, iterating. And so even though their focus wasn't on quality, they actually ended up producing a higher quality of photo. And I just think that's a great illustration about getting out there. Don't put too much thought or prep or planning into it. Just get out there and start doing things.
This may seem completely counterintuitive to people out there used to working in big corporates or maybe come from other places in the world. The schooling system in most of, I think, the Western world is you will be given an exam or you will be given an assignment and you have one chance to get it right. And we pour all of our blood, sweat, and tears, some of us in very thoughtful, protracted ways, and some of us at the very last minute. But we hand it in, just before the deadline, and we like wipe the sweat off our brow, and we're like, there, that's my best effort, and I'm going to get my grade, and that's the end of the world. And that's where we, I think, start to develop these implicit senses that failure is not an option, that we must do it right the first time, that perfectionism is the way to go. But this is all wrong, 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 especially when you're trying to build something of value to people that people will fall in love with. You need to let go of all of that, and you need to put something, as I said, embarrassingly incomplete, embarrassingly narrow compared to your grand vision out into the world and start to learn from your users, learn from the market, learn from your colleagues, learn from the investors you will eventually collect. And by the way, let's touch on investors for a moment. Unless you are a multi-time founder with a proven track record, investors don't invest in ideas, and increasingly, they can't invest in a team unless, again, you're that multi-time founder. They tend to, for first-time founders, invest in traction. And so you need to put the thing in the market and get people to use it, because that is what investors are going to invest against.
There is method to this madness, though. So we are talking about trying a lot of things, trying a lot of embarrassing things, right? If you're not embarrassed, you've waited too long. We're talking about not writing business plans, not doing this, not doing that. So what are we doing, and what distinguishes great execution from this stage from just chaotically throwing stuff against a wall?
So let's use the dreaded term that I think you and I have a lot of feelings and thoughts about and try to define it, right? So this term is MVP, minimum viable product.
I hate that term.
I know you hate that term. I hate that term as well. And it's one of those terms that seems to have permeated the entire world. Everybody has heard of an MVP. Many of the first-time founders who speak to me say to me, I've designed my MVP, or I've built my MVP, or we're working on our MVP. But almost without fail, they don't know what an MVP is, and their MVP is completely off track. So let me use a very simple analogy. The problem that you've maybe defined is getting from A to B. In your mind, you've designed a Ferrari. That's the coolest, best, fastest way to get from A to B. But the MVP of getting from A to B is not 4 Ferrari wheels. The MVP of getting from A to B is a scooter, a push-powered scooter. It's important to note here, it's not some wooden wheels, a plank, and a metal pole. It is a productized scooter, which means it has some industrial design, it has a user manual, it has a box, it has a website, it has a distribution channel, it has spare parts, it has a support phone line. It is a product, but it is not the Ferrari. That is the first product that you want to start with. That is your minimum viable product. Each of those words is essential. For me, the reason I get most frustrated with the term MVP is because A, people don't understand what it is, but B, they will often create an MVP, such as it is. It's often the wrong kind of MVP, but then they will quickly pivot or rotate to the next MVP. So they might do an MVP for a scooter and then rotate to start doing buses and boats, because those are other ways of getting from A to B. And they start to build lots and lots of janky, crappy, minimum viable products, rather than treating the scooter as the first thing that they're going to iterate on. So I encourage people now to move away from MVP and just call it version 1, because we're going to go build version 1.1 and 1.2 and 1.3. It does not end. It is the foundation on top of which you're going to continue to iterate, rather than just throwing spaghetti at the wall and expecting it to work kind of the first time out of the gate.
Okay, this is exciting because we talked last time about how we agree about everything, and I actually don't quite agree with what you said. So let's unpack that a little bit. You talked about the scooter, and I think I know that famous cartoon that you're referring to, but let's say, your end goal is a Ferrari. Now, we talked about being in the problem space and not in the solution space. So your end goal shouldn't be a Ferrari. An end goal might be giving people a driving experience that they find exhilarating or something like that. Now, to me, the first version of that probably isn't a scooter. It's probably you take my 10-year-old Toyota Yaris and you put some really big speakers in there. And whenever I hit the accelerator, you make a giant zooming noise and see how customers react to that. Because to me, I think the bit that we completely agree on, by the way, is that the core of an early stage startup is about learning, right? You have your problem space and you need to learn what your solution for that should be. In other words, what is a product that will get product market fit in your problem space? And so an MVP, it's actually the word product that's misleading there to me. I think, Eric Ries, who came up with the term, he had the term product in there for a very specific reason, which was that it should be something that real users use. In other words, it's a product. It's not a survey or a focus group or a study, right? It's a product. But he's using that term product very loosely. It could be a janky put together thing. It doesn't actually need to have a user manual or anything like that, in my view. The key of a minimum viable product is what is the purpose of it, which is to learn something specific. So in a sense, it is the vehicle that you use to validate a hypothesis you have about the type of solution that will solve the problem that your startup is trying to solve. It's less about version 1. I think version 1 is something else a bit. This is really about saying, okay, what is perhaps the riskiest assumption that we're making? Let's set up a hypothesis about that risky assumption, right? Which is, I don't know, people like loud cars. That's probably not that risky, but let's say that it is, right? So how do we make sure that our hypothesis or assumption that making loud zooming noises is an important part of the experience, how can we validate that's true? Your MVP should be the minimum piece of work that you need to do in order to successfully validate that in the real world with real users.
I don't disagree actually with your characterization there. And I think there are these kind of micro stages along the way where you need to solve certain problems for your startup at certain moments, and even in this early pre-product market fit stage, right? And so I absolutely agree. If you have these high risk assumptions built into your problem definition, built into your first solution hypothesis, you absolutely want to do early hypothesis testing around those. And you can absolutely, to use your metaphor, like tape some speakers to your Corolla and like see if the zoomy sound works. I really resonate with that and I like that very much. I think in the early days of Uber, in fact, it was run out of a spreadsheet. People talk about using low code solutions, throwing up simple web pages to see if anyone clicks through and signs up. There is some really, really early stuff you can do to validate the riskiest hypotheses. I think immediately after that, which is perhaps where I'm thinking a little bit more, you also need to test some of the right things about the first product. And let me explain a little bit about that. I often see people building kind of these unscalable technical demonstrations. And there's a common phrase in startup world, which is do the unscalable thing first. And they're very proudly doing things that don't scale, but they're not validating some key learnings. So when you put this product in people's hands personally and manually, you walk them through the premise and you walk them through the design, you walk them through how it works. There's a different relationship that they have to it and to you than if they're able to land on the site, learn about it, read an FAQ, onboard by themselves, and land in the dashboard or in the home screen and actually have to orient themselves. There's something that you learn from that you can't learn from a hypothesis test in a vacuum. It is, do people care about this package and do they grok it? Do they deeply understand it in their bones without me having to walk them through it? And I do agree with you that this is a little bit later in the process, but it is early and it's oftentimes overlooked as something that's a critical milestone.
I agree with you that ultimately you need to have a working product out there that people can use. And that's your V1. And actually, maybe a topic for a different episode. I think the weakest part of the whole literature on experiment-driven iteration, product development using that sort of scientific method is what I call the productionization, right? Which is once you have a successful experiment, how do you actually turn it into real product? But, I think the core learnings here that we're aligned on is that, first of all, whatever you're testing, it needs to be a product. And the meaning of product is it is something that users use by themselves, right? It doesn't have to be anything else, right? A common MVP is a landing page. I think that's one of the very common hacks is you come up with a landing page for a new feature or a new idea and see if people actually sign up for the wait list. But the point is, you're not sitting in there in a controlled environment asking them if they would use that product. You're actually watching their behavior. What I actually tell my team, because I'm a founder at an early stage startup right now, is that a startup is a learning machine. Until you hit product market fit, your execution motion should all be about learning and then refining those learnings. And that's the iterating piece until you get to product market fit. So everything you do should be viewed through the lens of what will this teach us? What will we learn from this? And that's often in the form of an experiment in the broad sense, right? Which is you have a hypothesis that you are testing. But even if you make it a little bit less formal, if you don't know what you're going to be learning by making a change, and then you don't ask a question, this is the minimum part of the MVP. If you don't ask yourself the question, could we learn the same thing in a cheaper way? You are doing it wrong.
Over 7,000 global companies like Atlassian, Dovetail, FlowHealth, and Quora all use Vanta to manage risk and prove security in real time. Why aren't you? Get $1,000 off Vanta when you go to vanta.com/TSP. That's VANTA.com/TSP for the Startup Podcast to get $1,000 off.
The other mistake that I often see though, and perhaps there's some tension between this idea and the idea we've been presenting. It's often easy to go to a lot of different kinds of users and learn a lot of different, perhaps opposing flavors of the same lesson. There's a tension, there's an art to doing this right. And that's why the very first thing I said was you need to pick a very specific persona with a very specific problem. Because The other mistake I see a lot of founders make is they talk to a lot of users or a lot of customers and they learn a lot of things. But I think of that as akin to staring at the GPS, staring at the data while they're driving and not looking up at the road. And to me, looking up at the road is applying your own intuition. You need to ask the right questions of the right people in the right way with your products, with the hypothesis you're testing and the things you're trying. And you need to then interpret the things you're learning in the right way. And you need to filter it through some kind of taste or intuition about the world. The analogy I always think of is, if Henry Ford asked the world what they wanted, they would have said faster horses. They would not have said a motor vehicle. If Steve Jobs had asked people what they wanted, they would have said a faster computer, not an iPad. To your point, Yaniv, you're talking about breaking down that hypothesis into a series of things like, do people like or can they tolerate the smell of, let's say, the combustion engine, or do they like a flat piece of glass and the lean back experience? You can test parts of that experience. But if you over-index on that learning from the wrong users in the wrong way, you can end up also taking away the wrong lessons.
Yeah, I think you're right. And, it's really interesting because I'm going through this experience, like I said, as a founder. And I think sometimes what happens is you don't necessarily know who is going to resonate with your offering early on. So what I've actually experienced personally is that sometimes your early tests, your early MVPs are quite broad, and you start to see who's resonating with that. But then you need to make some actual decisions, which is saying, instead of listening to all our customers, let's decide which customer cohorts are ones that we should listen to, and then we should make sure that we meet their needs. But yeah, it's really important to listen to that customer feedback. And I agree, although, I've been talking about the scientific method, there is a sense in which there is this irreducible amount of art to it, right? Where you use the word taste, judgment, things like that need to go into it. But you have to have a framework around that, because everyone thinks that their taste is incredible, right? So you put your taste in, but then you also need to validate that, learn where your taste needs adjusting, and continue from there.
Yeah, the thing is that I've become increasingly convinced that taste and intuition plays a very, very strong role in this process, because I think you can start to navigate by data once you have large volumes of users running through your system and you've moved from step function change mode into incremental mode. How do we juice more revenue, more conversion out of this thing that roughly has product market fit? And how do we optimize and operate this thing? But when you're at the very, very beginning, I think there is a larger role for taste and intuition and experience than most people seem to give credit. I think it is possible to set up the perfect experiments in order to arrive at the right answer eventually. But even setting up the right experiments takes some amount of taste and intuition.
Well, I actually think that's where the taste and intuition come in. Sorry to interrupt, but it's exactly right. Let's imagine you're running a series of experiments. You run an experiment, you get some results, and then you need to decide what experiment to run next. And you have a very broad and underdefined space there of possible next steps. And your taste and your intuition and your experience are what allow you to efficiently navigate through those steps to end up with product market fit before, to put a very sort of concrete view on it, before you run out of money, because that's the game of an early stage startup. Get to product market fit before you run out of money.
So then the next question is, how do you know that product market fit is not coming? How do you know when it's time to do the next piece of jargon, which is to pivot, to rotate to a different problem, a different persona, a different hypothesis, a different product?
I think it's one of those things where there isn't a good answer to that good question. But again, it's a judgment call. And again, where taste and intuition and experience really do come into this, right? If you have run a series of well-considered, good taste experiments and you're just not getting that traction, it's time to maybe consider a pivot. But there are two other sort of factors that go into it. One of them is how much runway you have. I'm sorry to keep bringing this back in, but I think any view of a startup that doesn't consider the capital aspect of it is actually, again, not the complete picture, right? What venture capital is doing, or like early stage funding, is you are getting a chunk of money and you're being told, get to product market fit before you run out of money. And that's your runway. And so the closer you are to the end of your runway, the more you need to consider, well, Am I going to take off before I run out of runway? And, am I on the right path? So I think that's one piece. Now, the other piece, and this is maybe where we can talk about the difference between a pivot and just starting again with a new idea, because I think those are different things, right? A pivot is you've gone along with your product idea and you've been learning. And in the course of that learning, you've learned something kind of surprising and left field is a need that you can't address with your current product. But maybe if you change and build a different product, there's actually a lot of evidence that you've built up that there is a viable business there. If you don't have that, you can't really pivot. You can start again, like I said. I'm interested in your thoughts on that though, Chris.
I think the word pivot is perhaps too broad. I think there's perhaps three distinct things you can do here. You can iterate, which is something you should be doing all the time. You should be learning, evolving your thinking about how this works, and iterating all the time. Then there's a pivot. As you described, there's a new insight that is really at a sharp angle from where you were headed, based on something that you've learned, some insight you've gleaned from all of this experimentation. It's a material change of direction. And then there's the restart, perhaps, where, this isn't going to work. Let's pause this and start again.
I really like the term pivot. It's actually very sort of graphic, right? You've got like two legs and you keep one of them planted exactly where it is, and then you swing the other one around, right? So you've got a fixed point and then a moving point. And what that's saying is, okay, we've learned something. There's a continuity between what we were doing and what we will now do, but it's a very significant change.
So let's talk about two flavors of the same mistake that we see founders make during a pivot. And you posted very eloquently about this within the last couple of months, I think, around hedging. And I see this all the time, where startups will intellectually make the decision to change directions, but they won't completely digest that decision emotionally and operationally. And I've made this mistake myself more than once, where you might change your target customer, but you fail to change the website or the pricing model or the roadmap or some aspect of the business that is a legacy hangover. And you might do that. And again, here's where the two flavors come in. You might do that accidentally because you didn't realize that this change in customer necessitates a top-down rethink of all of the aspects of the business. Or you might do that intentionally because you don't want to risk letting go of these customers you've acquired. Like, oh, well, we don't want to let go of this revenue or this momentum in favor of this other thing. Let's do both.
Yeah.
And so either by accident or by intention, you end up straddling two different worlds.
Yeah, that second pathology is really frustrating because that's what big companies face. That's the innovator's dilemma when big companies can't let go of a massive revenue source in order to pursue a new opportunity in a changing market. That's very understandable. If you're a startup, whatever revenue you've got, it's bugger all. So to hold on to legacy, to baggage in order to preserve that revenue or that customer base is nuts. I can easily see how it happens, but it's crazy.
Let's just talk about that a little bit again, because I think there's opportunities here to talk about why these things are counterintuitive and how maybe some of our young childhood education gets in the way. The first thing you have to know about the world, irrespective of whatever market you're in, if you're listening to this podcast thinking about running a startup, you are fundamentally in an abundance world. You're probably not starving. You probably have a roof over your head. You probably have some internet access. You live in a massively abundant world. There are some 7 billion people in the world that you have access to, and there are trillions and trillions of dollars. And your job in building a startup is not to create some little lifestyle business. And we talked about this in the last couple episodes. You're not building a small business. Your goal is to build something powered by technology with an unfair advantage that disrupts some fundamental aspect of life. This thing is supposed to scale. And so if you have 1, 3, 10, 50 customers, that is not a big deal. That is an early experiment. Your goal is to get all the customers, all the users for your particular category, for your particular problem set. Your job is not to build some healthy little business that's running along, that's in what I call zombie mode. Your job is to find some incredible high growth opportunity and hit a hockey stick curve in your growth. And so you cannot get stuck in the innovator's dilemma in your tiny little learning machine, as you called it, Yaniv, your startup. You need to find that high growth hockey stick curve.
Yeah.
And you need to find it quick.
Back to my LinkedIn post that you referenced, it's completely on this topic, right? Which is, it's about how to think about risk. And I'd actually like us to do a whole episode on this because I think this is really deep. But I think people are trained to be conservative and to hedge, right? We're like, oh, okay, we don't want to take such a big risk that it could potentially kill us. But that's actually the wrong thinking. And the earlier a stage you're at, the more wrong that is. And again, if you look at venture capitalists, but more than venture capital, if you look at the type of business you're trying to build, what you're really looking for is what's sometimes called a barbell distribution. The likely outcomes sit at two ends of the spectrum and, very little in between, right? So what you're looking for is either complete failure or complete success. Moderate success is pretty much worse than complete failure because it's just sucking up your time and energy that you could be using trying to build the next great success. So if that is your target distribution, if the biggest risk that your business is facing is not failure, but rather a lack of overwhelming success, then your view to risk has to be very different, right? The risk that you need to be hedging against is that you are not going to make it to that big success, not that you might fail on the way. And so your view of risk means you should actually be taking larger chances, or at least chances that have, a greater probability of complete failure, as long as they have a greater probability of complete success too. And, I think the implication of that is whatever you're doing, you should probably be doing with complete commitment.
What you're talking about there implicitly is a concept called opportunity cost. Every unit of energy that you put into your business, you're spending a piece of your life force, right? The only non-renewable resource is time. And so the question is, do you want to put that 1 unit of time, 1 unit of energy into something that is going to be a mediocre success, in that dumbbell uncanny valley of death? Or do you want to hit pause on that, which is a kind way of saying kill it, and move on to something else that is going to cross over into that outsized outcome? And I can hear a lot of people in the audience, putting myself in their shoes, who just come from a different school of thought, a different educational background, a different business background, saying to themselves, these guys are fucking crazy. It's just like, what are you talking about? This is insane. But you have to go back to our first episode about why software scales and about this kind of disconnection from costs to revenue and ultimately profit. This is what startups are about, not small business, not big business, not traditional ways of thinking and ways of life. This is a very particular kind of life, a very particular kind of mindset, a very particular kind of economic vehicle, special purpose vehicle, if you will. And it's a very particular kind of operation. So we want to always remind everybody that there are other ways to build a business, other ways to build a life that's not called startup. And you are welcome to go do those things if that's what your risk tolerance looks like and what your attitude and persona and perspective looks like. But our job here on this podcast is to help you understand this mindset.
Absolutely. And I guess there's two things I was thinking of when you were talking. One is, in a sense, we were talking about experimenting and iterating and MVPs. In a sense, as someone who works in startups, you can view your career, like if you zoom out one level, your career is a series of experiments where each experiment is one startup, right? And you want to learn from that. And then again, you want to move on to the next thing if that doesn't work. And in that same context as MVPs, that means that you want to run that experiment as efficiently as possible. So if it's not going to work, you may as well find out early and move on. What you don't want to do is string it along and have a very long-running experiment that ultimately ends in failure. So that's where that sort of fail fast mentality comes from. So that's one thing I wanted to say. And then the other is much more personal, which is I am mindful that as a founder right now, I don't always live up to what I'm saying. So there's a level of hypocrisy there. And I think that's probably, there's a strong emotional component to all of this, which it's quite clear at an intellectual level, the right way of thinking about this. But when you're turning up every day, you've got your team, you've got your people, you've got your product, you've got your customers. To risk all that, it's scary. And so it's important to keep reminding yourself that you are doing the right thing and that if you start pulling your punches and hedging your bets, then that is actually the worst thing you could be doing for everything that's all around you.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And I have to admit the same thing. It's very easy to say these things, and they are absolutely correct. And again, if you're listening to this from Silicon Valley or having run many startups before, you might even be rolling your eyes going, this stuff is obvious, it's cliche, everybody knows this stuff. The reality is A, they don't know it, or B, they don't take it seriously enough. And some of the biggest mistakes I've made in my career are just ignoring these axioms. There's another axiom, which is hire slow, fire fast. We're not going to talk about that at all in this episode, but I can tell you some of the biggest mistakes in my startup career have been to hire people too quickly and to fire them way, way too slowly because I'm a nice guy. I don't want to hurt their feelings. And the other big mistakes I've made are around this area of MVP and around this area of pivoting and failing fast. I was in a startup for 6 years, and I was in there probably 3 years too long. And during the course of that startup, we made too many half pivots where either implicitly and accidentally, we did not completely rotate the business over, and the business model or the website or the product strategy didn't change completely enough and didn't follow the rotation over. Or we hedged explicitly and intentionally, and we said, no, let's try to do both. Most of the advice I give startups these days, that they assume it comes from something like Uber, where, it was a great success. It actually comes from previous startups, which were giant failures of my own action to take the advice that are essentially well known, because I couldn't emotionally get myself there, or I forgot about it in the moment, or I didn't execute it well. And these are the biggest regrets in my career.
Yeah, well said. And, there's definitely, yeah, when you look at regret, I think about all the things that I regret in my career, and very rarely is it, oh, I did something too soon. It's usually I waited too long. And it's funny, there's that sort of classic self-help, like, never give up, never quit, whatever. It's just like some of the most terrible advice out there. I think courage in this way, and more than courage, it's like, how do you succeed? Recognize the signs and call it. And that's, that applies to when it's time to pivot, call it, commit to the new course of action. If it's time to move on to a new job, if it's time to shut down your startup, call it, because then you will have more time to do the next thing. And like I said, because of our natural inclinations to keep going, I can't remember a single instance in my career, and I've validated this with other people, whether this is firing people, leaving a job, or anything else, where people say, oh, I wish I'd waited a bit longer to do that. It's always, I regret that I waited so long and I wish I'd done it sooner.
I couldn't agree more. And that's what I find also when I speak to people, friends, founders, people who reach out to me. It's always that the pain has gotten so great that they've only just now started to think about changing direction, changing jobs, changing life trajectory. But often it's way, way too late. And so, yeah, I think generally speaking, the advice we're giving here is cut and run much earlier than you would expect. Now, there is counter arguments around, making sure you work your plan and making sure you thoroughly investigate certain things and not being thrashy. But I think you're right, absolutely, Yaniv, which is most people wait too long. And so in most cases, if you take this advice earlier than you would expect, you're probably doing the right thing. But just to give that warning, you want to be careful about being thrashy, about being premature, about, jumping like a hot potato from one thing to the next without properly executing and thoroughly running through a process. This is, again, where a bit of the art comes to it, but you need to find that line and walk it well.
I feel like there's often this level of emotional commitment, and, there's this principle known as the sunk cost fallacy, which is sort of well understood in behavioral economics, which is, people feel the more money or the more time, effort, the more emotional commitment they've put into something, the harder it is to walk away. And so consider to yourself how emotionally invested you are in something. If you're not emotionally invested in it, then, that's where there's the risk of thrashing, because you're like, oh, I tried this thing. I don't really care. I'll try something else. But if it's something that you really care about, a person you've hired who you like and you're seeing signs of improvement, but not fast enough, there is so much that is pushing you against keeping them on rather than doing the right thing for your business and ultimately for them usually, which is letting them go, that you don't really need to worry about thrashing.
So today, we've discussed what does good execution look like in an early stage startup? What the hell is an MVP? How do you get to product market fit and common mistakes early stage startups make, and maybe when to pivot and when to hold the course. Yaniv, I think the next time we meet, I think we're going to start moving along the stages of a startup. I think the next step here is scaling up. So let's say you've reached product market fit. What happens next? How do you grow this thing?
Yep, a whole new world of challenges.
A whole new world of challenges. But we'll discuss that another episode. For now, please jump in the comments. Let us know if you agree or disagree with us. Where do you think the product part of minimum viable product comes into this? When do you need to build that user manual? Yaniv and I had a slight disagreement about exactly when you start productizing that minimum viable product. So what do you think about that? And also jump in there and tell us, what do you think we should discuss next?
Also, subscribers, ratings and reviews on Apple Podcasts. It's really sad, actually. I go into Apple Podcasts every day and look to see if we've gotten any ratings or reviews. So please stop me from being so pathetic. Leave us a rating and review. It really helps a lot. As always, Chris, it's been fun.
See you later.
Today's episode of the Startup Podcast was brought to you by Vanta. Vanta automates compliance for SOC 2, ISO 27001, and more, saving you time and money while helping you build customer trust. Plus, you can streamline security reviews by automating questionnaires and demonstrating your security posture with a customer-facing trust center, all powered by Vanta AI. Over 7,000 global companies already use Vanta. Why don't you? Get $1,000 off Vanta when you go to vanta.com/TSP. That's VANTA.com/TSP for the Startup Podcast to get $1,000 off.